Gentlemen, as you know, we are running late.
Too fast.
Therefore, we need to be succinct, punchy, honest, direct, etc. So let's just have a conversation. Bevis, now, you were here last year.
Of course.
Now, are you, and there has, of course, been regime change, as I mentioned, in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
In terms of the banking sector, are you more or less optimistic now?
Well, I'm actually focusing on domestic operation. I'm trying initially 2 years ago when in this gathering, I was talking about banking. I focused on essentially banks should, Iranian banks should start with implementing proper compliance, risk management, internal audit in order to be comparable to international banks for doing their business. At the present time, I'm focusing on trying to, close to central bank, try to improve overall banking situation. In other words, what I'm trying to do is for restructuring or financial restructuring as well as operating restructuring of the banking system in association with the central bank, try to improve the situation. Now, getting back specifically to your question, based on the business that is happening in Iran, I am more optimistic. I see more and more banks are trying to get their operations up to international standards, which is perfectly reasonable and required. As I'm sure those who are involved in banking realize, there are a number of difficulties when restructuring of banks are being considered. In the first place, I suppose NPLs, non-performing loans, and transparency of the financial statements are really, Ulrich mentioned something with respect to
What's the
Islamic
percentage
banking.
of NPLs?
Well, based on the figures that we have is 15%, but you have to realize under Islamic banking, particularly with respect to, I guess, installment credit, the leeway is much more under Islamic banking compared to international standards. So consequently, percentage of NPLs that are presented or I guess announced by the central bank is roughly about 15%, which is not too bad, even compared with some of the European countries, particularly in the south. But still is quite a bit, and it's substantial. If you were to add, I guess, that discrepancy between Islamic banking and international banking probably would get higher to closer to 20%, which is much worse. But NPL is one of the problems. Certainly, I guess, lack of adequate capital in the banks is another point. The point which is really the case right now that I see is the banking system is outmoded in Iran. It's really have fallen behind compared to what's happening internationally. And I guess it was a survey of IMF study on something like 24 countries, the countries that required financial and operating restructuring of banks. All the items that are mentioned there is applicable to our banking system. We do have problems with our banks.
Let me stop you there and go to Matthew first of all, because you do fintech, don't you? I mean,
yeah.
So basically, if you want the financial sector to be more transparent, you should be the man to provide the transparency, the data.
Yes, basically that's true. Also, the market regulator, the capital market regulator is also having this system called CODAL, Comprehensive Database of all listed companies, including banks, so that they are required, based on law, to provide the information to public using this system. The system is in Farsi, but there are some other alternatives that are available in English, translate the data instantly to English and provide it to the market. So all the banks and companies and listed companies have to provide information quarterly, half-year, annual report, audited, non-audited. And also recently, since last year, they are required to provide one monthly activity report. For banks, they have to project their deposit accounts, the changes in their deposit account, and also their loans, and also their main NPLs. I mean, the interest income and also expenses they have to pay on deposit.
And
every month.
And do you believe the data? I mean, if we were in China,
you know,
for
the
example,
more frequent they provide data, all the companies, I'm not talking about the banks, the more frequent they provide, the more transparent they get, and the more reliable it gets. And also, all these companies have auditors, and the market regulator has a list of trusted auditors that companies have to use this, have to choose their auditor from this list. And recently, this list is also had a rating. So the auditors are also categorized in 5 different pools. Large companies have to pick their auditors from the first category, so best auditors. Getting high in this list is difficult. So auditing institutions have to go through merger and acquisition and empower themselves, make themselves bigger in order to be able to be high in this list and then audit these companies. Okay. So I mean, as we go on, I mean, when I look at it since 5 years ago, it gets more transparent, more accessible, and more trustworthy.
Mustafa, you're a banker. Are things improving or the same or going worse? Because you were here last year, I think, weren't you?
First of all, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm optimist, first of all. But to open my discussion, I would like to elaborate on some of the issues which our friend from KPMG raised, and also was the question of the participants over here. See, the foreign banks have not been fined due to lack of AML policies or CFD in Iran. They have been fined due to not observing US regulations. They have fined them due to overruling the US regulation and by the settlement agreement that they signed over there, which is a kind of delayed prosecution. Therefore, it is not the reason that the AML policies in Iran are not working well. The AML policy, the AML laws and regulations are in place. The Iranian banks are under supervision of Central Bank of Iran, which is the regulator, and they are 100% compliant with those regulations. And they are reporting all suspicious transactions to FIU, which is in Ministry of Finance. Even in European countries, up to 10,000 deposit of cash in the banks, there's nothing wrong with that. But in Iran, it's even less than 5,000 US dollars. If somebody is bringing 15 million 2 months, which is a little bit less than 5,000 US dollars, they have to substantiate that, and otherwise they will report it to the FIU. So the AML policies are in place, and the correspondent banking relationship that the Iranian banks have succeeded to establish with European banks, which are under European regulations, are fully complied. So we have provided them our AML policies, our compliance policies, and this has been accepted. Other banks who do not get involved in correspondent banking relationship with Iran is not due to the lack of those systems, those controls in Iran. It's that they are scared of the US sanctions. This is the reason. And another issue that it was mentioned that the other sanctions are still over there. See, the only sanction which was approved by the UN Security Council was nuclear sanction. That has been lifted. Other sanctions has never been raised in the United Nations Security Council. So even if one country unilaterally decides to put any sanctions, it is not obligated to others in order to comply with what they are doing. This is an important issue which needs to be considered. We are optimistic that European banks hopefully will not follow what is going to happen in United States and try to stick to the JCPOA. And also, we would like to share with them all the improvement that has happened in the Iranian banking system, the compliance, these are all placed. And the Iranian banks have been very keen to control the sanctions issues.
Yeah.
Why? Because otherwise they would have jeopardized their reputation, and it would have created risk reputation for them if they were dealing with anybody who's on the SDN list.
I take your point absolutely, but I mean, if you were HSBC or BNP Paribas or whatever, you still fear the long reach of Uncle Sam. And I thought one of the points that Ulrich von Santier was making was that actually you don't necessarily need the big banks. There are plenty of regional banks willing to come in. I mean, do you
I have to say something
Bevis,
here.
yeah, sure.
Oh, you mentioned the banks. I should mention it. HSBC, I used to work for.
They are my banker now as
Yeah.
well, so
But
I hope they don't get fined.
1.8 billion, which they were charged
Yeah.
by Justice Department, 1.3 of it was for Mexican transactions.
Latin America, absolutely. Yeah.
Mexican transactions, totally. $580 billion was transferred from Mexico through New York offices. So had nothing. Iranian cost for that transaction was 75 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? Going to BNP Paribas,
Yeah.
$9 billion they were fined by Justice Department. 6.4 of it was for Sudan operation.
Yeah.
22 billions of it was for Cuban operation. So that majority were other countries, had nothing to do with Iran. It was tiny bit. But the other point, Margaret, I think, asked about dollar transactions. We have no problem with that. We are totally complying with requirements of central bank, which is using euros everywhere as well as other currencies. We are working with Japan in yen. We are working with yen, I guess, with won in Korea. And same thing with other currencies without really any problem. It's the oil transactions which is creating some problem, which they have worked it out. I suppose on the spot they converted from.
Yeah. Jon, I'm sorry, 1 second, Jon, because I think Musfan wants to come in. You sure?
No, sure.
Okay, Jon. Now, you have taken the step as an export-import bank, so tell us why. And why not earlier?
Well, we did it as early as we could, I would say. Just
and explain exactly what you've done, actually.
Exactly. As the Export Credit Agency of Denmark, our mandate is, of course, to support Danish exports to countries like Iran. We do that by offering guarantees to banks or extending loans directly to banks in the receiving countries. And we were off cover on Iran until the agreement was made last year. But I think it was 2 weeks after the agreement, we opened for cover on Iran again. And we have so far approved, I think it's 8 Iranian banks for credit lines or guarantees. More can come. In this sense, we're a little bit demand-driven, so it's a matter of which one we have been asked for. But more could be approved. And in doing so, we're trying to fulfill our mandate to support Danish exports. What's still a bit missing in this chain is actually the Danish or international banks. We heard before there's sufficient of them. I tend to disagree. I'd like more international banks to be willing to do business in Iran. But there are a few, and actually coming back to your first question, are we more optimistic now than a year ago? If you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have been less optimistic than I am now. And what has changed then in the last 2 weeks? Well, one thing is that we in EKF have signed an agreement with the Ministry of Finance in Iran, opening up for the opportunity of a Ministry of Finance guarantee on certain transactions. It's not automatic. Both parties need to approve the specific transactions, but the possibility is now there. And even more importantly, a Danish bank also signed an agreement at the same day with 10 Iranian banks. So this Danish bank is very willing to do business in Iran, and that has been the missing link for us. We need Danish or international banks to...
And does the Danish bank also have clearing operations in New York? Or?
They have clearing operations in the US, and when you've said that, then I think I'd like to say actually that my take on what the international banks are concerned about is less, well, the sanctions, you can say. We try to explain them very clearly, at least, that we in our guarantee would cover if some new sanctions or snapback sanctions make it illegal to transfer money out of or to receive money from Iran. We would cover their losses on that. And I think actually amongst our ECAs, we are the ones that are most clear on this, that we do cover banks for this risk. Others have said specifically that they don't cover this, but we do cover it. So,
what are the other export credit agencies that have made the step? Austria, I think?
Austria is open for business.
This is okay.
SACE, the Italians, have been open. UCAF from the United Kingdom is open. But I wanted to say that I think the bank's main concern is not so much what can happen in terms of sanctions or what Mr. Trump can do by law. The problem is he doesn't rule by law. He rules by tweets. And all it takes is a tweet in the middle of the night to shame anybody who does business with anybody who does business with Iran. And then the clearing functions from these international European banks can disappear in the US, and that can create lots of collateral damage.
Mustafa, do you tweet?
No. But I would like to elaborate on the US dollar transaction. As you are well aware, the primary sanctions are in place. And none of the US financial institutions can get involved with Iranian banks. However, OFAC, in their latest issue in December 2016 guidance, they have authorized dealing in US dollar if US financial institutions are not going to be providing the services for clearance. In other words, supposedly, if an Iranian company has a buy US dollar from one of the German banks or UK bank, whatever, and they put it in their account, and they deal with someone else who also they are dealing with the same bank. If it is a kind of bookkeeping transaction, that is even okay. There's no problem with that. They cannot use US dollar while using the US financial institution for clearing. So if that correspondent bank, which has correspondent banking relationship with somebody with that bank, they open a US dollar account by selling the US dollar that they have bought for their own treasury, and then they can, by doing a bookkeeping transaction, debit the account of the Iranian partner and credit the account of the beneficiary, whoever it is.
So as long as OFAC doesn't go on Twitter and read Donald Trump's tweets, then we're okay.
Yes, and also in regards to a snapback, again in that December 2016 guidance, they have given a 6 months of wind down period, and whatever has been done until that time is fine, no problem, and can continue and to be repaid whatever has been used. But anyhow, there is a 6 months wind down period, permitting the partners in order to sit down together and finalize their project and then continue their business.
Matti, from your point of view, what would you need more from the banking sector?
I guess the more data they provide, the more transparent the market gets. So actually, at the moment, all the companies, including banks, they are providing their, as I said, monthly and quarter report and their first level of their balance sheet and P&L reports. But the more in-depth they get as for the data providing, because data providing has two sections. One is they provide the data in written documents, which is not processable by machines. One is providing data by pixels of data, by small parts of data, which is processable by machines. So the more data in a form of APIs and form of data they send out, it gets more processable by machines. And it gets more transparent by people, because processing data by hand and manually is a difficult job.
I mean, you're trying basically to do what Bloomberg does.
Yes, this is what I said. At the moment, you see, I think I have a slide about the data distribution in Iran. Companies are required to provide their data on a website provided by the market regulator called CODAL, Comprehensive Database of All Listed Companies, codal.ir. And they provide the data as form of data and scan documents as well, 2 times. And processing companies like us get this data instantly from this database and process it. By process, I mean we can compare the data with the history of the company itself and also with its competitors, other companies in the industry. So it gets more easily, much better to understand for analysts and investors. So companies like us get the information, compare it with other kind of information, projected in form of charts and reports, and also provided in English language so that investors can have much faster, much more reliable and accessible access to data. And all this process happens in less than 1 second. So all this is automatically. They publish the data, click the enter, the data pops up in our website, comparable to other companies.
Purvis, let's just, one thing that Ulrich from KPMG talked about was money laundering. Now, the Financial Action Task Force, I think, suspended Iran from its blacklist.
June 24th,
yeah.
Last year, and extended it again for 1 year. FATF. What has happened is that, unfortunately, as Mr. Mahdi mentioned, the information is not really what is going on in Iran, has not been passed on to relevant authorities throughout the European countries. There is an institute called Basel Institute, University in Basel here, for 3 consecutive years has put the name of Iran at the bottom of the list. And the figure that they have, 8.6, is not changing. Means they have not approached anybody, anywhere in the country, and we've got, whether it's AML, is throughout the country, is absolutely carefully applied by all banks. CFD just as well. It's rule of law and land. Everybody is applying it. They have not approached anybody, whether it's for, there are annually more than 50 Iranian border guards that are murdered because of drug money coming in from Afghanistan and from east of Iran. And the section on drug money and this, which is another point out of the 100 points of evaluating different countries. Again, the same figure is used for Iran. I think Iran is really a robust approach towards that. Whether it gets to regulations, whether it's transparency, financial statement. We are following in our bank IFRS. We've done it, and it's mandatory for all banks next year to have IFRS.
Is Pascal doing the same? No.
They're doing it next year. But they have to do it. The central bank has required it. So all the information is there. They don't even bother to approach the relevant authority, and FRU at the Ministry of Finance regularly provides the information to FATF in Paris. So the information is there, but it's not really publicized. And because of that, we get the figure of 8.6 at the bottom of the list. And I'm very disappointed.
But at least you're suspended from the blacklist.
Well,
could be
thank
worse.
God. Thank God. It could, well,
Johan, what's your view on this? Johan, in terms of when you're giving your credit guarantees, do you think the KYC, the Know Your Customer idea is working properly in Iran?
absolutely.
No, but I want Johan. You've got a vested interest.
No, it's an issue that we need to take care of course. And on the other hand, in this regard, it can be seen as an advantage that there are few Danish banks willing to do business in Iran because, well, they are our customers, and by law, we do not need to make KYC on the Iranian bank as such, but we want to do it anyway because there's a sanctions picture and everything. But we work closely together with our guarantee holders, the Danish or international banks in this, and make sure that their procedures for making their KYC in Iran in this case is sufficient and safe, and that is working for us so far. It allows us to do business and approve banks.
Excellent. Let me throw this now open to the audience. Questions to any of these gentlemen? And there's a question there at the back, and then there'll be a question here. Gentleman at the back at the moment who's standing up, and I think one of the young ladies right at the back. You've got a long way to run. No, you'll be number 3. Just over here, by the loudspeaker. Don't forget the order in which I'm going to be pointing. 1, 2, 3, and I think a fourth. There we go.
5.
Okay. Yes.
Yep, perfect.
A question for the bankers, really. A very down-to-earth question.
Can you say who you are?
Yes, my name is Livia Manzini. I'm from Bell Holding, a company based in Istanbul.
Excellent.
Very down-to-earth question. For somebody who is making an investment in production plant in Iran, does Iran have facilities such as leasing or other financing facilities relatively longer term for the purchase of machinery and equipment? Thank you.
Mustafa?
We do.
It should be working, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, there are leasing companies in the country, but the banks usually are in mainly short-term financing. There are some leasings which you can refer to them and they would be able to provide you the required financing. However, I would like to highlight that that depends on the size of the project and how big is the financing requirement. They might not be very, big in the sense that to finance big projects, and for this reason, Iran needs financing from outside of the country. And we can, recommend that most of the financing for bigger projects should come from outside of the country. And right now, many some banks, for instance, there's a bank affiliated with COFAS. They have studied the Iranian banking system, and they are providing short-term financing according to the regulations, doing all the KYC issues. But regarding to the question, we do have, but not for big projects.
Okay. And there was a question just here. Yes.
Hi, it's Kush from Ernst & Young again. This is a question for Mehdi, actually. When we talk about fintechs and introducing new technologies, particularly into banks, what are the main challenges that you see in order to do that? And I ask that because my experience so far in Iran has been a lot of the core banking systems are either old or they were built in-house. Often data quality needs enriching, right? It could be better, and that probably causes an issue in being able to to get them to be more digital, for example, and introducing those technologies. So a question for you, what are the main challenges?
I think especially for the banking system, the main challenge that we're facing is API, application development interface. And then the problem is that with Iranian IT companies, unfortunately, hasn't been very successful in developing their APIs. I mean, they didn't have this culture of providing API in order to make other people empowered to provide other kind of softwares on top of their software. So I think the major challenge in the banking system, because I'm in contact with some of the major core banking developers, is that the lack of talking of these software to each other. I'm trying to be not to be too technical. So, but on the development side, I don't think that we have a problem of knowledge of developing. I mean, in Iran, we do have access to very good developers, and I think the cost of developing softwares like core banking is much less than what you have here in Europe. But unfortunately, these softwares haven't been able to evaluate themselves, to develop themselves based on third-party participation. And recently, these core banking system have faced these issues, and because these issues have been raised by all small developers. And recently, they are trying to provide more and more API, more and more access to the core banking of the banks. Also, banks they have internal IT teams to develop on their core banking system. So I think in the coming years, we would see much more complicated and much more sophisticated softwares built on top of the APIs of this banking system.
Thank you. There were two gentlemen at the back, and then I think there was someone. No, there was a gentleman here, I think, was first. Oh, well, in that case, you have the microphone, therefore you have the power.
Okay, thanks a lot. First of all, thank you for the discussion. I have a...
Can you say who you are?
Yes, sorry. Carsten, I work for Procter & Gamble. I have two questions. One is the basic one, which is about, we hear about the two foreign exchange currencies. So the one is the official, the other is the market rate. What is the view on the panel if at some point in time this could be merged? And the second, a more tangible question, assuming a company was to do a banking transfer into Iran, what is the FX rate that would be used? Should it be the official rate? Should it be the market rate? And what is the exposure? Because we see some of our banking partners are proposing both, sometimes the market rate, sometimes the official rate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bevis.
With respect to your first question, I think it's central banks' plan to have the two rates merge into one market rate, essentially. And that will hopefully happen within a year or two. It's still, they have for certain items, particularly, I guess, agriculture commodities, etc., and some medicine, they are using the subsidized rate, the central bank rate, but overall is mostly moving towards market rate. With respect to the second question, again, if you are transferring funds into the country, you should, even under FIPA, which is the Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Act, you can transfer it and you can convert it at market rate, and you will be, that would be acceptable to FIPA. So essentially, it is moving towards more and more market rates.
Thank you.
Both questions.
There was, sorry, you want to come back? Yep. A silent microphone. There we go.
Okay, it's working This is Mehdi Azdizadeh. I'm from Aerial Investment Group. I have a question to Dr. Aghili. First of all, Dr. Aghili, it is always a privilege to have you in Iran and in the banking sector in Iran. Having you there makes the people like myself quite optimistic about the future, as there are a limited number of people who understand banking properly, and it is definitely one of you, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
My question is regarding the banking sector in Iran and the problems that we have. The solution obviously is not a rocket science. Some of these banks do not have a healthy balance sheet, as you know better than anyone, and they have very high NPL ratios. I talked to some of the IMF guys when they visited Iran and some of the consultants. You don't think the only solution to the banking problem in Iran in the long term is to consolidate some of these balance sheets and also to take out the bad debts, create a good bank, a bad bank, and also let some of these banks to go bust, because some of them really are running a big Ponzi scheme in Iran. Do you think the government has the guts and they're willing to do that? And do you think this is going to happen, at least some of the big mergers to be happening in the next couple of years? Thank you.
Okay.
As I was saying, I have done a study, and the cost, to give you an example, Korea did reorganization, restructuring of their banks in 2002, and it cost them about $170 billion. My estimate is our balance sheet, overall the banking sector, is about $700 billion, above and below the line, as of the latest figure of 6/21/2017, end of the first quarter of the Persian year. Out of the 700 billion, my estimate is it's going to cost Iran, if we were to do the approach that Korean took, about somewhere between 180 to 200 billion dollars, and we cannot afford it. What I am, hopefully my paper will come out
So it's not
soon.
a question of guts then?
I'm getting to that. We have to do that in two phases. A phase one of about 3 years, allowing the existing management, and which is what I call Japanese style, which means the existing management to clean up their balance sheet. They are given about 3 years. They have transparent financial statements over the course of these 3 years, and it should be known to them. Part of it, central bank is doing already. But they have to be known that Basel III requirements, which is by the end of 2018, is the end of it, they have to have proper capital adequacy, meaning those banks which are 6% or lower, they should be completely shut down. Between 6 and 10%, they should be allowed to merge into one another, bring in new capital, and however they can to survive, meaning 10% reaching that milestone, I suppose, and then no capital, no dividend to be allowed for the second phase, meaning over the course of 6 years, we will get at least out of the 35 banks that we have, about 13 to somewhere around half of them surviving have to be, and the government has to be gutsy, whether we like it or not, and shut down. Some of those banks they have to be shut down. They are really in not an acceptable shape.
Jorn and then Mustafa. Jorn.
I fully agree. I think that's a very workable solution, and that there is work to be done in Iran, cleaning up banks' balance sheets, and what you just said sounds like the right way to do it. I'm just reacting because the suggestion was perhaps to let some banks fail. And seen from abroad, we would become very insecure if that was to happen. Some of the banks that we have approved today would not have been approved if it were not because we thought, well, they will not be allowed to fail. Yeah. But there's cleanup to be made, but in an orderly way.
Mustafa.
We need to remind ourselves that Iran had 3 years of bad economic years during the previous administration, even the negative growth. So it has created lots of problems. And followed by a tight monetary policy by the Central Bank of Iran, which has created some liquidity shortages in the market. I'm 100% sure that even though if we put aside some of the wrongdoings of some smaller banks, if the economy starts to recover, then those NPL issues will be resolved as well somehow and by the rescheduling them. And we need more time. If the economy doesn't move, yes, that would be the solution.
But I'm assuming you were in favor of the tight monetary policy for the overall health of the economy.
It has helped a lot, but at the moment, we need to move our economy. So, in fact, in some areas, we should take tight monetary policy, but in some other areas, we have to have some easing of the policy. Otherwise, the economy cannot move.
Yeah. QE will happen. We are really pushing our time, but you had a question there.
That gentleman.
Oh, sorry, there was a...
For a long time.
That
Yes. Okay. I'm spoiled for choice. Go for it. Okay. Yeah.
Hello there. My name is Hamid Anushapur. I'm representing Kangan LNG Company, which is a company under AMG, Aryan Mahtab Gostar in Iran. I've been working for Iranian banks and also representing some of the European banks previously. I'm throwing a simple fact here, and that is we are in the process of tendering for our projects, and we are naturally moving towards Southeast Asia, and that is because traditionally the bulk of projects in Iran were financed through ECAs, mostly in Europe. Now, the absence of major ECAs in the financing of projects has been the cause of this move towards the other parts of the world. So, well, I heard from Ulrich that most of the obstacles in this way have been regulatory measures, but am I right to think that apart from that, there are some other reasons than regulatory measures, maybe political issues, that has caused this absence of ECAs? And that is simply the reason why we are actually removing the names of the European peer companies out of our list. Do you think that, maybe Jorn can answer my question, do you think that the other ACAs will follow suit? Because as soon as you concluded the line with Iran, one of the projects under my holding company has actually signed the agreement with the European companies and actually enjoying.
Keep that there, and then gentleman here. So that'll be a question for you on, okay, on ECAs.
Hi, I'm Gabriel from Suez Company. My question is for our Danish friend. We're about to sign a sizable project with the Ministry of Energy in Iran, and which could have a significant part of Danish equipments. Okay, my question is there any Danish bank together with the Danish ECA thinking about building up buyer's credits in the country in the next future?
Okay, thank you. And a final question. There was another hand that went up. I felt guilty that I'd missed it. It was, yes, just right over here. Oh, sorry, that's a final question. Well, ladies first. So, yes, she should definitely have the microphone. Sorry.
My name is Andrea Saldarriaga, and I come from the Iran Business Responsibility Project. And my question is for Jorn.
He's the star, you know, and he has the most wonderful socks.
I couldn't see them, but anyway. And my question somehow relates to the first question asked by the to you right now. And we've heard from some ECAs from the OECD countries that probably one of the difficulties to get deals through is applying or getting the due diligence on social and environmental issues to the standard of OECD common approaches. So my question is whether you are facing some similar challenges, or you think that it is also probably a difficulty for approving those deals, and if you see that there are challenges, how are you addressing those issues? Thank you.
Jorn, the floor is yours. You are the star now. 3 questions for you.
Thank you very much. I'll take the last question first. And actually, I have to say that despite our intentions, we haven't been doing all that much in Iran since we opened, because we've been lacking this banking channel there. So the few deals that we have done have not given us those big concerns in matters of CSR and environmental issues that you were mentioning. For bigger projects, which are still to come, we are looking at one particularly at the moment, more investigations need to be done in that case, and it remains to be seen whether it will be a problem. It can be a problem in many countries around the world to get access, and maybe not all places you have same ideas about these issues, but no reason to expect beforehand, I'd say, why this should be a problem in Iran. And if I may continue,
yes,
then?
Please.
Yeah. Will more ECAs come along because one of us is doing it? That's indeed our hope. And for many of the transactions we do, not every equipment is coming from Denmark. So we try actually to, share the burden, reinsure ourselves with other ECAs on many specific larger deals. And in terms of Iran, it's still an issue, and there's some confusion amongst our colleagues also, I would say, what the sanctions are meaning and what importance they have. So I do believe that sometimes you need somebody to do it first and show that things can be done, and we are about to do that thing, so to speak.
There was quite a specific question from a gentleman there.
And then there was the question about a buyer's credit, and it sounds good that you have a deal with Danish contents. We love that. So we would be willing to look at it, and if your Danish exporter is a customer with, the Danish bank that so far does this with Iran, I'm sure they would be happy to look at it as well. And again, then we would, if it's not all Danish, we would look to where the other parts of the equipment is coming and talk to that ECA
Excellent.
as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Did I hear your question as if you said the word buyer's credit, meaning without a bank, an Iranian bank involved, selling directly to the Iranian buyer?
No, but directly from the bank to our company.
Yeah, and I think it's most realistic to think that there will be an Iranian bank in between for the foreseeing time, for the coming time. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think it's been a very good panel, and I think they deserve a big, big round of applause. My apologies